Good morning, Year 10. It's Mr. Sutton here, and hoping you've had a nice half-term holiday. Today, we're going to have a little bit of a look at what I would call reverse engineering. And what we've got here is something you're probably all very familiar with, and it's mobile phone. And it's been exploded, or what we would call an exploded view. Now, an exploded view is something which a bit later on we will be looking at drawing with you, because it's one of those key skills that you need to build up so that you can do an exploded view of key bits and pieces that you design for Unit 1. The reason we're looking at it today, though, is we're going to be doing something called reverse engineering. Now, you've obviously got quite used to doing product analysis, which is where you look at the product and you analyze aspects about it. And we use the Access FM part to be able to do that part. Now, when we do reverse engineering, it's a little bit different. We often also call it product disassembly, but it's where you actually, in effect, take a little bit more of a deeper dive, a little bit more of a hidden look at actually the functions and the individual parts of a product. So if we look here, we've got, in this nice exploded view, we've got all the parts of what looks to be one of the first generation Apple iPhones. So if I go through these, you'll probably be quite familiar with these. We start at the top here, and we have got the main sort of menu button and the glass just there. So we've got the top glass layer. We then come down to the screen. In between these is obviously the touch sensitive part as well, so you may well have, and you can just see that little bit of circuit board coming down, well, not circuit board, but ribbon cable coming down. So the top of the screen will have some sort of layer on it that is actually the touch sensitive part. You then have the actual LCD screen itself just there, which produces the image. And then we start to come down into the PCB, so the printed circuit board. Now, these are obviously very, very complex indeed, and will hold all the individual parts and components that we need in order for the phone to actually function. And we have an SD card slot, or actually no, SIM card slot, where it slides into there on the bottom of the phone. You've then got the lithium-ion battery, and we can see that we've got the back of the case, and we can see some little bits and pieces. For example, you've got this kind of little ribbony bit just here, which is probably the aerial, and some other aspects of it. So you've got some of the ribbon cables that are still within it. Obviously, we have a little bit more like the bezel around the outside. Now, I've obviously just listed what those individual parts are, but what I haven't done is what reverse engineering actually is, and it's talking about the interrelationship between these individual parts. So rather than me just sort of saying, this is the top screen, this is the function button, what I would actually do in reverse engineering terms is I would start to think about what each of these bits, their function is, and how they interrelate. So for example, we have got just here the glass just here and the touch sensitive membrane underneath it, and I would say that they obviously work hand in hand with the screen beneath to allow you to have touch sensitive control. So you can obviously change the menus and things like that. So they go hand in hand. Those two parts obviously work together. They then, of course, come down into the printed circuit board, which its main function is to do all the functioning. It's the electronic brains. It's the main part that does all of the heavy lifting as far as the phone is concerned, and it communicates drawing power from the battery. So we've got the lithium-ion battery, which is rechargeable and draws its power from the mains when it's being charged, usually via USB, but I can't actually see if this one's got a USB on it. But it supplies its power to the printed circuit board that then obviously provides the display and the computing power, and etc. If we then think about, if we come in a little bit closer on this one and we come down, we could talk about the main shell of the actual phone functioning to allow it to protect all of those components. So it draws everything together. You've got this bezel around the outside, which I do believe in these phones is actually the aerial as well. And it joins those all together so that you can have it securely placed together, protecting the screen, protecting the PCB, protecting the battery, and enclosing it all in one. So by doing that, what I've done is I've kind of just touched on that reverse engineering idea, which is where you kind of talk about what the name of the individual component is, but then what it does. Now, you've been quite used to the sort of external Access FM, but there are some sort of Access FM internal bits, and I will put these into the actual list for the topic. And that's things like the individual components, how it's assembled, so the assembly, the repair and maintenance, because we've got this lithium-ion battery and we know that eventually will need replacing. So does it mean you have to take the phone completely apart to do that? And it certainly does, in this example, mean that it would have to be done. If the screen gets smashed on here, that can be repaired and replaced without having to replace the whole phone. Of course, we do know that sometimes that can be very expensive, and therefore sometimes it's just not worth doing. How are they recycled? Mobile phones are terrible for that particular one because they're made of many different integrated and quite complex parts. So actually getting them to be separated out into their individual materials is quite tricky. Interrelationship. How do they relate to one another? And finally, the innovation. How does it actually innovate? Well, we know that this particular mobile phone, when it came out, was very innovative because, of course, it was one of the first phones that had this touch-sensitive screen. Now, we've got different things that you can have a look at, and what I've done is I've given you a couple of different ones. One is a drill, and it's an exploded view that you can see here. And again, I would like you to kind of label up this, or, as I've got here, and I will be bringing it down, this particular bike. So we've got an exploded view here of a bike. Now, both of these products are fairly straightforward and simple, the bike in particular, but they've all got key parts, and those parts have all got an interrelationship with the rest of the parts of the bike. So the frame, the wheels, the seat itself, the handlebars, the crankshaft, the sprocket, the cogs, you name it, we've got all those individual bits. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at either one of these, and it only needs to be one, you don't have to do two. And I'd like you just to label up the parts, and if you're not sure about what they actually are, then try to find out. Hopefully with a bike that's going to be very straightforward because most of you will know that, but if you're wanting something a little bit more challenging, then the drill is a good one to go for. And then I want you to think about potentially what they're made out of and what their interrelationship is with one another. What's their function? What do they do? So, some of these internal parts just here with like the spring and etc. might be a little bit more complicated. I think this is actually the clutch assembly, as it's called, which if you've used an electric drill before, if you change that, it slips more easily depending on what setting you have it on. So sometimes it's a lot easier, so it doesn't strip the screw, and that's done in a similar sort of way to a car kind of clutch onto that one. And obviously it's powered through from the motor and the battery, and you've got the switch there and everything else. But I'd like you to think about either of these and do a bit of reverse engineering, which is where you use either of these images and basically choose those, and they're in the PowerPoint, and I'll put down the Access FM and then these extra ones for the internal Access FM. And I'd like you to have a look at those and think about the interrelationship. This little bit of reverse engineering. And remember, it is reverse engineering we're trying to do. Really think about how the interconnectivity and how they affect one another and how they influence one another's functions. Upload that one and we'll have a look through those and see how we've done. What I will also try and do is I'll have a look through some of the bits and pieces that we've done previously, that is before half term, when I asked you to do that old and new one. So I'm going to have a little look at that one and see how we've done with that, and I might share that with you a bit later on in the week. Okay then, Year 10, have a really good one, and I will speak to you all soon. Take care.